Okay, welcome everyone to the HathiTrust Emergency Temporary Access Service office hours. I'm Melissa Stewart, Assistant to the Executive Director of Trust, and in a few moments, Graham Detmers, our metadata analyst, is going to talk about discovery. First, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. We're at for this webcast that you all keep your camera and your microphone muted. So as not to be too distracting for us during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window. We have some HathiTrust staff online here to answer questions. And then also, I'm going to read some questions aloud to Graham at the end of the presentation. All right, and without further ado, I'll hand it over to Graham.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Melissa, for introducing me. As Melissa said, I'm Graham Detmers, the metadata analyst here at HathiTrust. The main goal of today's session will be to walk you through all the moving parts of HathiTrust metadata that are available to you so that you can identify and make accessible to your patrons the content to which you now have access via the Emergency Temporary Access Service, or ETAS. This necessarily starts with the overlap report as the key, so I'll begin with a review of those reports and then open up into the larger world of HathiTrust metadata and metadata provisions like the Hathifiles, Bib API, and then finish with some highlights from our third-party discovery partners. Much that I'll be covering is explained in a slightly different fashion and documentation available on the HathiTrust website, linked at the bottom of this slide. Another goal will be to provide some examples of how our members have already activated ETAS and made these new resources available to their patrons. I reviewed the attendee list for this meeting, and I don't think any of my examples come from your institutions, so I won't be showing you anything you've either seen or perhaps already implemented yourself. So to start, I want to share some of those examples so that you can hold an image in your mind of what's possible as we move through all the nuts and bolts, gears and widgets that HathiTrust makes available to you so as to aid in discoverability of ETAS activated content. But first, the homepage for the HathiTrust. I want to remind everyone upfront that while we're going to be walking through a variety of optional methods to integrate HathiTrust records and metadata into your local catalog or discovery layer, there is always the simple option of linking out directly to the homepage from your library's front page. We'll cover automatic login later, but the homepage can also be modified to force automatic login for your patrons so that they will be able to see every item that is temporarily accessible to them in their search results as they use the HathiTrust online catalog. Now I'll highlight some of the ways our members have represented ETAS linking and availability to their users. Cornell University Library has done an excellent job of making use of the Hathifiles. More on that in a bit. They had an innovative approach to using this provision before the pandemic. So they were in a prime position to quickly leverage their overlap report to integrate and display the newly accessible material to their users. In addition to this, Francis Webb of Cornell also wrote an accessible blog post detailing the process they went through to achieve this end result. The link to the blog post is available on this slide. And as we work through the Hathifiles in a bit, and if you find this option interesting, I highly recommend reading their post. Columbia University libraries have made use of the Bib API when integrating HathiTrust content into their catalog. You can see the link on the bottom right of the screenshot. Note the wording of the link, log in for temporary access. Oxford Libraries, the Bodleian Library, is a Primo customer and made use of a community-developed package to make available the HathiTrust content easily identifiable directly in their search results. And last but not least is the University of Delaware Library. They use OCLC's WorldCat management system. More on this later, but our long relationship with OCLC made identifying and integrating ETAS activated content a simple process for those members that use it. After showing you those examples, I want to mention a third goal of this session, a byproduct really of the second goal. And that is to convey that in our analysis, those institutions that have integrated ETAS record metadata into their catalogs or discovery layers consistently appear in the top of our use rates analysis. These use rates are calculated by unique visits in our use logs and the campus population of students and faculty. We've identified that 6 of those institutions rank in the top 10 and 17 are in the top half of all the institutions that have activated. The caveat here is that these are just those institutions that we know of, meaning I've either directly worked with them or they've let us know in one way or another what work they've done. Okay, now we're going to start with the overlap reports. This is where we start assembling the pieces we'll need. The overlap reports are created from the most recent print holdings that you have submitted to us. So if the last time you submitted a holdings report was in 2018, your access detailed in the overlap report will be a reflection of your holdings at that point in time. If you want to submit a more current holdings report, please reach out via our feedback email address and we can get that process started. As I just alluded to, we generate the overlap report by cross-referencing your holdings against our digital collection. The overlap reports, as detailed in the Venn diagram on this slide, indicate which in-copyright items in your most recent print holding submission are available to you through ETAS. After your ETAS application is approved, your designated ETAS contact should have received notification of where to find your report. Once that report is in hand, so to speak, our analysis and the larger process can begin. This is a small sliver of a larger overlap report, one I pulled at random from the box folders. The 5 elements of the overlap report are OCLC, which is the OCLC number, your local ID, often but not always the 001, the item type, which is serial, mono for monograph, and multi for multi-part monograph. Access, which can be allow, deny, or just empty. An empty field under access means that either HathiTrust does not have a scan of this volume or that there isn't enough metadata to make a match. Rights is the code for the reason behind the rights determination. PD for public domain, IC for in copyright, and UND for undetermined. You can see examples of each in this snippet. Now we'll start making connections. For the purposes of ETAS, the 2 most relevant volumes on this overlap report snippet are the bottom 2 rows. You can see in the orange circle at the far right that they both have an access designation of deny, meaning that they are now available for temporary access under ETAS, whereas before they were only available in limited access. The blue circle is the local ID, and the red circle is the OCN for each of these serial volumes. We're starting with the local ID, the actual cataloged item in the institutional's holdings. From there, we're going to follow the relevant OCN in red to an upcoming slide. But before we get there, I want to talk about the next metadata provision we make available, the Hathifiles. What we call the Hathifiles is a tab-delimited file of all the current digital items in HathiTrust corpus, approximately 17 to 17.5 million by the last counting. HathiTrust makes these files available publicly on our site. You can find them at the link on the bottom of the slide. On that page, you'll find a list of the nightly updates and the full corpus files posted and complete by the second of each month. Incidentally, the full files are an application destroyer. One of these files can only be opened programmatically. Consequently, all the upcoming examples are from one of the nightly updates. Now that we know about the Hathifiles, we can connect the OCN from the overlap report to the same value as represented in the Hathifiles. The Hathifiles, however, do not have headers, though there is a separate header file that can be programmatically integrated into the Hathifiles themselves once you've downloaded both files. But for our case here, column 1 from the overlap reports, OCLC, connects to column 8 of the Hathifiles. This is the only value that is present in both of these files. Chad Nelson at Temple University has an excellent blog post detailing how he was able to isolate and whittle down the Hathifiles against the overlap report. The link to that is at the bottom of this screen. I want to point out before I move on that you can see that in the Hathifiles, there are 3 separate instances of the OCN, whereas there are only 2 in the overlap report. This simply indicates that HathiTrust holds more items than the institution for which the overlap report was generated. But under ETAS, that institution will have access at the record level, so your patrons would have access to every volume of the serial or multi-part monograph associated with the OCN that we hold. Now that we've made the connection between the overlap and the Hathifiles, we can move our focus directly to the Hathifiles. And once we're working there and we have our OCN, the next most important value is column 4, the HT bib key, circled here in green. The HT bib key is also known as the cluster ID and is the identifier that is used to create the URI for the catalog record in HathiTrust. You can see 2 URIs here. The first is the regular URI, and while the second is the URI for the automatic login syntax added to the end for your specific institution, in this case, the University of Michigan. More on automatic login in a second. Here's the page in HathiTrust for this particular record, one of IEEE's many, many, many publications. These are the wide range of digital items for this particular serial. The university name on the right is the institution that contributed the scan, not an indicator of who has access. If we follow the highlighted item, second from the top, we'll see a third metadata element at work from the Hathifiles. We'll move on, as before, from the OCN to the HT bib key to column 1 of the Hathifiles, the HTID circled in purple. The HTID is the persistent identifier for this particular digital item. Unlike the cluster ID, which can change depending on which record is selected via the preferred record selection algorithm from Zephyr, this value will not change. It is persistently associated with this digital item. On this page, because I'm not logged in, you see that this item is as it would normally appear, not available online, limited search only. And now that I've shown you a modified syntax, and you've seen the page without the user having logged in, I'll cover automatic login. Effectively, automatic login refers to a string that is appended to any HathiTrust URL that will pass your users through your authentication service before they land at the page indicated in the HathiTrust URL. This removes confusion for users as they don't need to walk through the login process from scratch on the HathiTrust page. The login button is clearly visible on all of the HathiTrust pages, and clicking it begins a process familiar to most users of any internet service for which they would have an account. But adding the single sign-on string saves them extra steps and possible frustration. And so now that we have the HTID for a particular digital item, and we've covered automatic login, we're able to create a direct link for our patrons in the event that we make a complete list of the available items in our local catalog. You can see here that to the basic handle syntax has been appended the automatic login information for the University of Michigan. Using that exact URI from the previous slide, you can see that I'm now logged in, and this work is available to me to check out for the next hour. Here, we're at the University of Michigan Library's catalog page for this record and digital items that we've been working with these past few slides. You can see the purple circle down below at the bottom of the screen. That's the URI for the HTID digital item with the U of M single sign-on URL appended. The pink circle is the list of items you saw from another earlier slide, and within that is the link I hovered over to get the purple circled link below, bringing it all around. The text for each of those linked volumes says, full text available, HathiTrust login required. A special modification the University of Michigan Library made on the standard text. Now that we've received the crucial values for connecting your overlap report to the Hathifiles and seen it applied, I want to walk through how these same values can be used to integrate the bibliographic API into your catalog and discovery layer. This is another set of those 4 key values from the overlap report and the Hathifiles. Those values again are the HTID, the HT bib key, the OCN, usually the 035, and the local ID, often, but not always, the 001. Here are those same values plugged into an API call. You can see the color scheme I used earlier carrying over. I'm highlighting the identifier type here because while the values carry over, the terminology doesn't in all instances. HTID and OCLC are the same, but HTBib key is record number, all one word, for the purposes of the API call. Also, these are just for the brief record. It is also possible to call the full record if you replace the in the syntax brief with full, but for the sake of everyone's vision on the upcoming slides, I stuck with the brief record. Each of those 3 different calls returns the same JSON file, regardless of which one you use. I've applied the color scheme here too to indicate the presence of each of the values from the Hathifiles and the overlap report. To keep it already overwhelming slide readable, I haven't included the labels as I had before, but the color scheme of green for HTBib key, purple for HTID, and red for OCLC number persists here as well. Here is another example from Indiana University. You can see that via the Bib API, they've integrated links into the catalog record page. The link appends the single sign-on URL so that the user will pass through IU's authentication service and be taken directly to the digital item, available to check out now that they've been authenticated. The HathiTrust Bib API can take an array of up to 20 values of the same identifier type at a time. Also, I want to underscore that the API has not been modified to represent the temporary access state for ETAS. So the calls will still return the text of limited search only for those items that are restricted during normal operations. You've seen some of the examples of the modifications that other libraries have made to represent on that normal text to represent the new temporary access. So some modification will have to be done on your end if you want to transform the text to something else, like temporary access, click here, and so on. Beyond the Bib API, there are also options to go through third-party vendors. We've established strong ties with many, if not all, of the major vendors in library land. Because by definition, the emergency came as a surprise, we're still busy exploring new and easy ways to make HathiTrust content widely available across multiple platforms. I'm going to highlight some examples from our members that use different discovery layers to make ETAS activated content available. But if you know of some product or vendor that we're not working with, I want to know about it, so please reach out via our feedback email address. And while I'm going to point to example implementations, I'm not going to be able to cover the specifics of how to implement each of these options. Though this session is primarily about ETAS discoverability, I do want to highlight that under normal circumstances, HathiTrust full view content is still available via these usual suspects. I've worked with each of them, and they should have established a schedule for updates, or if they haven't yet, they should be soon. I mention this because I know stale records and update schedules have been a source of concern and frustration in the past. In addition to the HathiTrust Bib API, there are vendor-specific packages or processes you can make use of to surface ETAS links and content. The Ex Libris Cloud apps for Alma is new to me as of last week, but I wanted to highlight it because I know we have an overwhelming number of Alma users here today, in case it could be of use to anyone who hasn't seen the post in the Ex Libris Developers Network, linked here. As highlighted on our How to ETAS page, the University of Minnesota has an add-on to Primo that can be used to incorporate HathiTrust records. It was updated shortly after ETAS was launched to take these new circumstances into account. I've been working with folks at Innovative to develop documentation or a workflow for Sierra, but at the moment I don't have anything to share about that, but I am working on it. And finally, OCLC's WorldCat management service is easy to activate ETAS records through. Because it'll create a separate ETAS collection for your institution, it will also be simple to deactivate once that time comes. So to wrap up the presentation portion, I want to just return to our initial examples and show again how these integrations look in practice, this time with all of the possible options in mind. First is Oxford, who has been making use of the University of Minnesota plugin I just mentioned. They use Primo as their discovery layer. I'll be using the same work, the French language excerpt of Finnegan's Wake, for each of these examples. So in the yellow circle are the cataloging details. You can see from the link at the bottom, circled in green, that the link used is the HathiTrust catalog record for this work, making use of the HT Bib key or cluster ID. And here we have Cornell again, implemented via Voyager and Summon as detailed in the blog post I cited in the original appearance of this image. Again, the catalog data is in yellow, and here they've used the HTID to create a direct link to the digital item, circled here in purple, with the automatic login URL appended. And last, but again not least, we have the University of Delaware Library. They submitted their overlap report to WMS support, and an ETAS collection was created of their newly accessible items, complete with all the necessary links with a single sign-on URL appended. You can see the ETAS availability is highlighted on the right side of this page, and that they link directly to the digital item, similar to Cornell. The major difference here is that because this is an OCLC product, I was reliably able to use this particular item to find this particular item in their catalog using the OCN, the accession number, circled again here in red. And that brings me to the end of the presentation portion of the webinar. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, or if you want to follow up later, the feedback email address is listed at the bottom of this slide. As Melissa said, these slides and a recording will also be made available to attendees later on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Graham. And again, please type your in the chat window. I'm going to start out with the first one for us, Graham. Our links to Hathi from the catalog are search string by OC number. Is it possible to pass users through authentication with these?
It should be. This question has come up once before to me, I think, and we did test it locally. I'm pretty sure it should work, but if not, please reach out and we'll see if we can modify things on our end to make that work.
So the automatic login can work for any of our Hathi books, not just an ETAS?
I'm sorry, you broke up for a second. Could you repeat that?
Yep. So the automatic login can work for any of our Hathi books, not just those in ETAS?
Yes, and that the user will be logged in. It doesn't necessarily make it available to look at if it's not something you hold in your, and that was mentioned, that was identified in your overlap report. But the user can still be logged in via Shibboleth that way, or via probably Shibboleth, whatever the service is.
Okay, we do have some folks on the call that have done some catalog integration.
Very cool.
Tufts and Harvard. Oh, we got an update after our initial ETAS report. Exactly is updated.
Melissa, I think I might be able to take that one. This is Jessica. The initial ETAS report that went out, there are links there in your Box folder. So Karina Yes, okay, from Harvard, I see there. You should have received then an email that included a link to your Box folder. Within that folder, there are ETAS reports at the usage level and item level. Those are updated weekly. And then your overlap report is updated monthly. So really you should be receiving and have access to those 3 files. So hopefully that answers your question.
This is another, does that mean that after our originally print disclosure, there might be additional ETAS items? I think that's again for you, Jessica.
Yeah, so it is possible then that because of the ingest that is happening regularly in HathiTrust, that there might be an item that you have on your shelf that is then digitized and is now available through ETAS. So that is a possibility.
Yes, to the best, I can echo that. To the best of my knowledge, the gears of HathiTrust haven't stopped. So it's possible that things get added, or that we're able to do some course or some OCLC number. The word is escaping me at the moment, but be able to identify old LCLC numbers and match everything up. So it's possible that more content could be made available, though probably not in a significant, probably not a significant amount at any given time.
It says, so in theory, if we have a new deny line item in the monthly that wasn't in our original overlap, that means we have another book we can access through ETAS.
Yes, I believe that's the case.
That's right. This is Natalie, and the print holdings are a process that I manage. Karina, that is correct.
Does anything get removed from the overlap, like we lose access?
I can take that one as well. There is some chance that you will lose access to an item if, for example, you previously reported it to us in your holdings, and in a more recent print holdings update that you provide to us, you no longer report that item to us. It's also possible that there can be updates in OCLC number matching that can move items around between the clusters in our catalog records. And so it's also possible that while you might not have lost access to an item, the linking might need to be refreshed in order to make access to that particular item work.
Yeah, I can echo that again, just to say, like, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, only the HTID is persistent and persistently identified with that digital item. The cluster ID can change, and so there's every incentive if you're using the Hathifiles to make sure that you are updating or refreshing that as frequently as makes sense for you, because the ID or the HT key cluster ID can change over time.
Okay, the auto login page needs an entity ID. Is there an easy way to find out what that is?
Yes, there is. It is listed on the automatic login page. I believe, somewhere within either the how-to documentation or that I linked earlier on, or the automatic login documentation, should be a link out to the listing of all those entity IDs. So you can just find the one for your specific institution, and then that would plug in.
All right, any more questions? I'm curious about the advantages of the integration of HathiTrust in Alma in place of or alongside Primo.
That is a good question that I do not have a ready answer to. I'm going to speculate a little bit based on just my quick review of the Alma add-on or development post that was made in the Ex Libris developers community. Is that I think the two are using the University of Minnesota's package for Primo. The effect should be very similar, because the example used in the Alma post was also the Bib API. So the biggest difference I would imagine is that the Alma integration would allow maybe some more local control, but I'm not an expert on Alma or Primo enough to get into any of the subtle distinctions. I would imagine for the users, it would ultimately be about the same. Also, I imagine that the Bib API in the Primo integration works every time that the user searches, and so is updated as frequently as the search is performed. Whereas I'm not certain what kind of updates, like how the Alma integration piece would work on a schedule and keep up to date. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying I don't know.
I just have a comment, Graham, that in Alma is the only way to identify your ETAS access. That Primo plugin calls Hathi API, but API doesn't tell you whether you have access. Do you have any other questions for Graham? I am going to stop the recording, but you can feel free if you have any more questions. We're going to hang out for just a few more, and so feel free to type any questions in the chat or continue any other comments that you'd like right now, but I'm going to stop the recording here.